Power rarely announces where it is shifting. It reorganizes routes, sensors, and margins. In the far north, a vast landmass sits between oceans, air corridors, and warning systems. Nothing dramatic changes on the surface. Quietly, the geometry of security adjusts. This is why Greenland matters to the United States, not as territory and not as symbolism, but as leverage over systems that shape the Arctic and the Atlantic together. Most discussions miss this, focusing on headlines instead of mechanisms that decide access, reach, and constraint. We'll move step by step through the logic behind this priority, narrowing possibilities as each factor locks into place. The final reason isn't obvious, and it reframes everything that comes before it. By the end of this video, you'll understand why. Greenland enters the story not as a prize, but as a hinge. Look at an air route map across the North Atlantic. The shortest paths between North America and Europe don't bend toward capitals. They pass over ice, water, and empty space. Greenland sits directly beneath those lines. Not nearby, not adjacent, directly in the way. During the Second World War, aircraft range made this unavoidable. During the Cold War, bombers and missiles hardened the logic. Today, nothing about that geometry has relaxed. Aircraft still need corridors, signals still travel along predictable arcs. Distance still matters. Here, geography does not offer options. It removes them. This is not about controlling land. It is about denying bypass. There is no alternate route that avoids this space without cost. No detour that preserves speed, coverage, and response time at once. Pause here, because this is the first fracture. Once Greenland is acknowledged as unavoidable terrain, neutrality collapses. Someone must watch the sky above it. Someone must maintain access below it. Ignoring it does not preserve balance. It hands initiative to whoever does not. Not expansion, interception, not dominance, position. From this point forward, every strategic choice tightens. Routes converge, planning compresses. The freedom to pretend this space is peripheral disappears. And once geography stops offering flexibility, other systems begin to close in behind it. Geography forces surveillance, and surveillance pulls technology into the equation. Seeing first is not an advantage. It is a prerequisite. In the high Arctic, early warning radar installations sit far from cities and headlines. Domes, arrays, cables running into frozen ground, they look static, almost outdated. But they are not watching the present, they are watching time. During the Cold War, this mattered because minutes separated warning from catastrophe. That logic never disappeared. It was refined, compressed, automated. From Greenland, radar coverage stretches across approaches that no satellite alone can fully replace. Ballistic trajectories, aircraft paths, signals that appear briefly then vanish. This is not about certainty. It is about narrowing uncertainty faster than an adversary expects. Here is where pressure builds. Once detection systems are placed, they dictate response timelines. Political leaders do not choose how much time they have. The system does. Decisions accelerate or collapse based on what those sensors see or fail to see. Pause again. Because this is where flexibility erodes. If detection is late, options disappear. Diplomacy shortens. Verification weakens. Assumptions harden into reflexes. By the time information reaches decision makers, the range of acceptable responses has already narrowed. Not reaction, anticipation, not escalation, compression. Greenland's role here is quiet but structural. Remove it and blind zones grow. Keep it and planning stabilizes at the cost of permanence. Once such systems are embedded, they cannot be easily withdrawn without creating gaps others will notice. This locks commitment in place. The United States does not maintain early warning systems in Greenland because it wants visibility. It does so because without them, uncertainty grows asymmetrically. And asymmetrical uncertainty is not neutral. It favors whoever is willing to move first. By this stage, geography has already forced surveillance. Surveillance now forces permanence. And permanence begins to attract attention far beyond the Arctic itself. When warning systems become permanent, the technologies that support them start shaping political choices elsewhere. The pressure here does not come from what exists. It comes from what is forming. In the Arctic, sea lanes are not yet highways. They are seasonal corridors, part ice, part water, part projection. But shipping maps already mark them. Insurance models already price them. Naval planners already simulate them. One route in particular draws attention. The passage that cuts between the Arctic Ocean and the North Atlantic, skirting Greenland's coast. It is not the shortest path on paper. It is the most controllable one in practice. Ports are the anchor, deep-water access points carved into ice-bound coastlines, facilities that can refuel, resupply, and quietly monitor traffic that has no alternative path nearby. Once ships begin using these routes regularly, those ports stop being optional infrastructure. They become leverage. This is where assumptions begin to fail. The common narrative treats Arctic shipping as an economic story, time saved, fuel reduced, markets connected. But for security planners, it is a sequencing problem. Commercial traffic arrives first. Oversight follows. Military presence arrives last, framed as protection. Pause here, because once traffic normalizes, neutrality erodes. If shipping passes close to Greenland, someone must track it. Not to control commerce, but to understand who can disrupt it and how quickly. Surveillance expands. Patrol patterns emerge. What began as monitoring becomes expectation. Not trade, exposure, not opportunity, obligation. At this point, alternatives narrow sharply. Ignoring these routes creates blind spots. Overcommitting risks escalation. But abstaining entirely hands influence to whoever is willing to accept the responsibility first. Greenland sits at the convergence of this dilemma, not as a gatekeeper yet, but as the place where oversight becomes unavoidable once traffic increases. This is how economic movement hardens into strategic presence. Quietly, gradually, without a single formal decision. And once movement through the Arctic becomes routine, pressure shifts inland to the systems that support and protect it. As shipping stabilizes, the resources beneath the ice begin to matter far more than the routes above it. Distance is usually measured in miles. In the Arctic, it is measured in response time. From Greenland, Russia's northern military infrastructure is not abstract. It is mapped. Airfields, submarine bastions, radar sites aligned along the polar arc. What looks remote on a globe compresses quickly when aircraft, missiles, and sensors are involved. This proximity creates a limitation before it creates a threat. Strategic depth, the space that allows mistakes to be absorbed, shrinks in the high north. There are fewer layers, fewer buffers, fewer places for uncertainty to hide. Every movement is detected earlier. Every signal travels farther than intended. The consequence is subtle but structural. When two powers operate this close, deterrence stops being about capability alone. It becomes about posture. Where assets are placed, how often they move, whether silence is interpreted as restraint or preparation. Pause here, because this is where miscalculation becomes more likely, not less. From Greenland, surveillance does not just watch outward. It watches sideways. It observes patterns, not actions, training cycles, readiness rhythms. Deviations that suggest pressure building elsewhere, not confrontation, calibration, not attack, signaling. But signaling cuts both ways. As monitoring improves, so does sensitivity. Small changes register quickly. What might have been ignored in another theater now demands assessment. Options narrow because delay itself becomes a signal. Doing nothing is no longer neutral. For the United States, this proximity forces a choice that cannot be deferred. Either maintain awareness from Greenland, or accept that Russia's northern posture will be interpreted through gaps, not data. Those gaps would not remain empty. Once one side commits to persistent observation, the other must assume it is always being seen. That assumption shapes deployments, exercises, and escalation thresholds, long before any crisis appears. This is how proximity turns geography into pressure. And as Arctic monitoring tightens between rivals, the burden does not remain bilateral. It spills outward, toward alliances that were never designed for this level of compression. When distance collapses between rivals, alliances inherit risks they did not plan for. Alliances are designed to distribute risk. In the Arctic, they also distribute responsibility, and that creates friction. Greenland sits within the Kingdom of Denmark, politically European, militarily tied to NATO, geographically isolated. This combination produces a contradiction that alliance structures do not resolve cleanly. The concrete anchor here is administrative, not military. Command responsibility, airspace control, infrastructure funding. None of these are abstract questions when radar systems, runways, and ports require constant maintenance in extreme conditions. Historically, NATO was built to defend lines running east to west across Europe. The Arctic introduces a vertical axis, north to south, sparse population, long distances, limited redundancy. The alliance framework stretches, but it does not fully adapt. This creates a quiet dependency. When an area is vital but thinly resourced, leadership concentrates by necessity. The United States does not step in because it wants dominance. It steps in because coordination delays create gaps, and gaps are interpreted as weakness. Pause here, because this is where shared responsibility begins to blur. Multiple nations may have a stake, but only one can move quickly enough to maintain continuity. Exercises, upgrades, and surveillance cycles demand consistency. Committees do not provide that. Systems do, not alliance unity. Operational reality, not shared control. Singular execution. As U.S. involvement deepens, alternatives fade. European partners retain political ownership, but operational reliance grows. Over time, this becomes self-reinforcing. The more one actor stabilizes the system, the harder it becomes to replace them without disruption. This is not a failure of NATO. It is a structural limitation. Once Greenland becomes a critical node for alliance security, ambiguity disappears. Either someone guarantees stability or instability invites testing from outside. That guarantee carries weight, financial, political, strategic. And as responsibility concentrates, another pressure emerges. Control over infrastructure begins to overlap with control over resources, materials that will shape future power far beyond the Arctic. When responsibility concentrates, economic leverage quietly follows behind it. The pressure here is not immediate. That is precisely why it matters. Beneath Greenland's ice sit mineral deposits that modern economies quietly depend on, rare earth elements, critical inputs for electronics, guidance systems, energy infrastructure. These materials do not decide battles. They decide who can sustain capability over time. The tangible anchor is a map of licensed exploration zones. Remote sites, sparse roads, limited ports. On their own, they look uneconomical, but resource strategy is not about extraction speed. It is about option control. Historically, supply chains tightened elsewhere first. Concentration increased. Single points of failure formed. Greenland entered planning not as a solution, but as a hedge, a place where dependence could be diluted even if production remained minimal. This is where the logic turns. Once a resource is deemed strategic, its location becomes sensitive regardless of output. Access rights matter. Regulatory standards matter. Infrastructure that supports research, transport, and monitoring begins to overlap with security presence. Pause here, because this is where economics becomes restrictive. If the United States disengages, others fill the vacuum. If it overcommits, it accelerates competition. Either way, neutrality is not stable. The choice is not between mining and not mining. It is between shaping the rules now or inheriting them later. Not extraction. Leverage, not profit. Optionality. As attention increases, flexibility decreases. Environmental constraints, local governance, and international scrutiny narrow what can be done and who can do it. Each agreement locks future decisions into a tighter corridor. By the time materials are urgently needed, the window to influence access will already be closed. Greenland's resource potential therefore functions less as a promise and more as a constraint. It forces early positioning, quiet commitments, long-term presence justified as precaution. And once economic hedging begins to drive security posture, another system tightens around it: logistics. The ability to move, supply, and sustain presence across distance. When resources demand protection, mobility stops being optional and starts dictating force placement. Power does not arrive where it is needed. It has to be moved there. In the Arctic, this is not a theoretical problem. It is mechanical. Aircraft require runways that can handle weight in sub-zero conditions. Ships need ports that remain accessible despite ice, weather, and distance from supply hubs. Fuel, maintenance, and personnel must arrive on schedules that cannot slip. The concrete anchor here is infrastructure. Arctic airfields carved into frozen ground. Deepwater access points along Greenland's coast. These are not symbols, they are bottlenecks. Historically, transatlantic strategy assumed layered redundancy. Multiple routes, multiple bases. The Arctic disrupts that assumption. There are fewer alternatives, fewer places to divert. When conditions close one option, there may not be another within reach. This is where pressure builds quietly. Once logistics are established in Greenland, planning changes elsewhere. Deployment timelines shorten. Exercises align around Arctic access. The ability to move forces across the Atlantic becomes conditional on maintaining readiness in this single environment. Pause here, because this is where flexibility starts to vanish. Without Greenland, reinforcement routes lengthen, response times increase. Deterrence becomes theoretical rather than credible. With it, commitment hardens. Assets rotate through the same facilities. Supply chains settle into predictable patterns. Not presence, sustainment. Not force, continuity. This continuity creates its own constraint. Once logistics flow through Greenland, withdrawing them is not neutral. It signals retreat, even if none is intended. The cost of stepping back grows higher than the cost of staying. For the United States, this locks mobility and credibility together. To remain believable in the North Atlantic and Arctic, movement must be possible at all times, not just during crises. And when mobility becomes constant, attention follows. What was once support infrastructure begins to attract scrutiny, pressure, and counterplanning from outside actors. At that point, logistics stop being background detail. They become a strategic exposure. As mobility hardens into routine, the need to predict conditions ahead of time becomes unavoidable. Uncertainty is tolerable only when it is shared. In the Arctic, it is not. Greenland's ice sheet is monitored constantly. Sensors embedded deep in ice. Weather stations along the coast. Satellites calibrated against ground truth. These are scientific tools, but they feed directly into security planning. The tangible anchor here is data infrastructure. Measurement stations that track ice thickness, melt rates, storm frequency, and seasonal variability. On their own, they appear academic. In practice, they shape what planners believe is possible. Historically, military planning assumed environmental stability. The Arctic breaks that assumption. Ice that once supported movement no longer does. Sea conditions change faster than models predict. Runways, ports, and routes must be recalculated continuously. This creates a new form of pressure. Those who collect the most reliable data adapt first. They adjust logistics windows. They refine navigation. They plan exercises with fewer surprises. Those without access plan against outdated assumptions. Pause here, because this is where knowledge becomes asymmetric. Environmental data does not escalate conflict. It narrows margins. It reduces the space for improvisation. When conditions shift suddenly, the side that anticipated them gains time. The other loses options, not science, forecasting, not awareness, advantage. For the United States, maintaining monitoring capability in Greenland becomes inseparable from maintaining operational credibility. Without accurate environmental inputs, every other system, logistics, surveillance, mobility, degrades. This creates another lock-in. Scientific presence justifies continuity. Continuity supports security. Security reinforces scientific access. Each element stabilizes the others. By this stage, withdrawal is no longer a clean choice. It would not simply reduce presence. It would introduce uncertainty into multiple planning systems at once. And uncertainty, when unevenly distributed, becomes pressure. As environmental awareness tightens operational planning, it also signals something else to outside observers: permanence. And permanence invites attention from actors who were not part of the original Arctic balance. When data shapes readiness, outside powers begin looking for ways to access or offset that informational edge. Influence does not require control, it requires presence. In the Arctic, that presence often arrives quietly. Research stations, infrastructure proposals, investment in ports, communications, or resource exploration framed as commercial or scientific cooperation. None of this appears confrontational. That is precisely the point. The concrete anchor here is dual-use infrastructure. Facilities that support civilian activity but can also shape access, standards, and information flows. Once established, they change who is consulted, who is delayed, and who is excluded. Historically, regions left underdeveloped tend to invite outside interest. The Arctic followed the same pattern. As activity increased, so did attention from non-Arctic powers seeking long-term positioning rather than immediate influence. This introduces a contradiction. Greenland is not a contested battlefield. It is a planning space. But planning spaces matter because they determine who is ready when conditions change. When new actors show interest, existing stakeholders are forced to clarify their own commitments. Pause here, because this is where absence becomes risk. If the United States reduces engagement, others gain footholds that are difficult to reverse. If it reinforces presence, it signals exclusion. Either choice narrows diplomatic flexibility. Neutral ground becomes aligned ground by default, not expansion. Prevention, not confrontation, preemption of influence. As competition enters the Arctic, Greenland's role shifts again. It becomes less about defending against a single rival and more about shaping the rules of access. Who sets standards? Who controls information? Who is allowed to linger without explanation? At this stage, delay carries cost. Waiting does not preserve balance. It hands initiative to whoever is willing to invest earlier and accept long timelines. Once that happens, restoring equilibrium requires far greater effort than maintaining it would have. By now, every system is under pressure. Geography, surveillance, logistics, data, economics, competition ties them together. What remains is the deeper truth that explains why this convergence could not be avoided. At this point, Greenland is no longer a location. It is a multiplier. Every system we've followed converges here. Geography forced attention first. Surveillance locked it in. Trade routes added exposure. Proximity compressed reaction time. Alliances shifted responsibility. Resources pulled economics into security. Logistics hardened presence. Data erased uncertainty. Competition removed neutrality. None of these alone explains the priority. Together, they make it unavoidable. This is the deeper truth. Greenland does not grant power by itself. It amplifies the power of systems that already exist. It shortens distances for aircraft. It extends warning time for sensors. It stabilizes logistics chains. It improves environmental forecasting. It constrains rivals' assumptions before they act. That amplification reshapes strategy, not by enabling aggression, but by narrowing acceptable risk. When a state understands more, sees earlier, and moves faster, it does not need to escalate to protect its interests. It can deny space quietly. Influence without confrontation, not dominance; structure, not control; constraint. The long-term consequence is subtle but permanent. The Arctic is no longer a peripheral theater activated only during crises. It becomes a constant input into planning across the Atlantic and beyond. Decisions elsewhere are made with this space already accounted for. This sets a precedent. Future competition will not center only on borders or battlefields. It will concentrate on systems that decide access, timing, and information before conflict emerges. Greenland is one of the first places where this logic became visible in full. That is why the United States treats it as a priority, not because of ambition, but because the cost of absence compounds across every strategic layer at once. When all systems converge on a single point, disengagement is no longer neutral. It is a decision with consequences that cascade outward. Understanding that is the difference between seeing Greenland as remote and recognizing why it quietly sits at the center of modern power.